Here is a question that sounds strange. Why did every major mass extinction in the history of life occur roughly every 300 million years? Not every 100, not every 50, exactly 300. Coincidence? No. This is a rhythm, the rhythm of a planetary heartbeat, the supercontinent cycle. Every 300 million years, the continents gather into a single landmass. The climate inside that landmass becomes unbearable. The oceans lose their oxygen. Most life dies. Then the supercontinent tears apart, and life explodes with new diversity. This has happened 5 times. The Permian extinction, Pangea. The late Devonian extinction, Gondwana. Every time, the same machine. And in March of 2026, Harvard University published evidence in the journal Science proving that this machine started 3.5 billion years ago, 500 million years earlier than anyone believed. This is its complete history. Before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel. Your support really helps us to continue this work. Thank you. There is a number that puts everything in perspective. 300 million. That is how long, in years, the average supercontinent cycle takes from assembly to breakup to assembly again. 300 million years. To put that in context, 300 million years ago, the first reptiles were just learning to lay eggs on dry land. Dinosaurs would not appear for another 50 million years. The Rocky Mountains did not exist. The Atlantic Ocean did not exist. The Himalayas, the Alps, the Andes, none of them existed. The entire evolutionary history of mammals, birds, flowering plants, and every ecosystem you have ever seen or heard of fits inside one supercontinent cycle with room to spare. This is not a story about ancient history. It is a story about the operating system of the planet, the deep machinery that runs beneath everything else and has been running since before complex life existed. Every ocean that has ever opened, every mountain range that has ever risen, every mass extinction that has punctuated the history of life, all of it traces back, ultimately, to the motion of tectonic plates and the rhythm of supercontinents assembling and dispersing. And here is what makes this story different from a geology lecture. The supercontinent cycle is not neutral. It does not simply rearrange the furniture of the planet while life continues unchanged. Every time continents gather, the consequences for biology are severe. Ocean circulation changes. Vast interior regions become deserts. Shallow seas disappear. Deep ocean water loses its oxygen. Species that had been isolated from each other for millions of years suddenly find themselves competing on the same landmass. The weak go extinct. The cycle is, in the most literal sense, an engine of extinction and an engine of evolution. And every time continents disperse, the opposite happens. Isolated populations evolve independently. New ocean basins create new habitats. Shallow coastal environments multiply. Biological diversity explodes. The world we live in today, with its extraordinary variety of species on different continents, its diverse ecosystems, its complex food webs, is a direct product of the fragmentation of the last supercontinent. We live in the aftermath of Pangea's breakup, and we would not exist if it had not happened. The story we are about to tell spans 4 billion years, 5 supercontinents, and the entire arc of complex life on this planet. It begins in a world of liquid rock and ends with a prediction for what the planet will look like in 250 million years. Along the way, it will pass through frozen oceans, poisoned atmospheres, the birth of oxygen, the death of the dinosaurs, and the rise of the mountains that redirected the monsoons that shaped human civilization. Every chapter connects to the next. Every geological event has a biological consequence. And the machine driving all of it has been running without interruption since before anything alive today had any ancestors worth mentioning. This is the complete history of Earth's supercontinents. Let us begin at the beginning, the Hadean and the first crust. There is no gentle way to describe the early Earth. 4.5 billion years ago, the planet you live on was a sphere of liquid rock. Not a planet with some volcanoes, not a warm world with occasional lava flows. A ball of magma, tens of miles deep, with a surface temperature hot enough to vaporize iron. The Moon, which had just formed from the catastrophic collision between the proto-Earth and a Mars-sized body that geologists call Theia, was orbiting at roughly 1/10 of its current distance. Its gravitational pull was so strong that tides in the magma ocean rose hundreds of feet. The sky was orange from a thick atmosphere of vaporized rock. This is the Hadean Eon, named for a reason, and it lasted for roughly 500 million years. And then something remarkable happened. The magma cooled. Not quickly, not uniformly, but inexorably. The heavier elements, iron, nickel, sank toward the center, forming the core. The lighter silicate materials floated upward and began to solidify at the surface. The first crust, thin, unstable, constantly being recycled back into the interior by the volcanic heat below, but crust nonetheless. A surface, a beginning. The oldest minerals we have found on Earth are zircon crystals from the Jack Hills of Western Australia, dated to 4.4 billion years ago. These tiny crystals, each smaller than a grain of sand, contain chemical evidence of liquid water at the surface at an astonishingly early date, which means the planet was not an uninterrupted hellscape for its entire early history. There were cooler periods. There were surfaces stable enough for water to pool. And where there is water, there is the possibility of something else. But before we get to life, we need to understand how the machine started, because the entire story of supercontinents depends on one thing: plate tectonics. The process by which the outer shell of the Earth is broken into rigid pieces that move relative to each other, driven by the heat escaping from the interior. Without plate tectonics, there are no supercontinents. Without supercontinents, the history of life on this planet would be unrecognizable. For decades, the question of when plate tectonics began was one of the most contested debates in Earth science. Some researchers argued that modern-style plate tectonics only started around 1 billion years ago. Others pushed it back to 3 billion or even 4. The problem is that the older the rock, the harder it is to find and the harder it is to interpret. The geological record gets fragmentary the further back you go, like a book where the early chapters have been partially burned. In March of 2026, a team led by Alec Brenner at Harvard's Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences published a study in Science that provided the oldest direct evidence yet for moving tectonic plates. They analyzed the magnetic fingerprints locked into ancient rocks from the Pilbara Craton in Western Australia, some of the most ancient exposed crust on Earth, dating to 3.5 billion years ago. When rocks form, magnetic minerals within them align with Earth's magnetic field, recording both the direction and the inclination of that field at the time of their formation. By comparing the magnetic signatures of rocks from the Pilbara Craton with those from the Vaalbara Craton in South Africa from the same time period, the team found that these two pieces of crust had moved relative to each other. They were not stationary. They were already drifting. This is the earliest documented instance of relative plate motion by more than 500 million years. What it means is that the engine driving the entire supercontinent cycle was already running 3.5 billion years ago, when the only life on Earth was single-celled microorganisms living in shallow marine environments. The machine that would eventually build and destroy every continent on this planet started while life was still learning how to be alive. The significance of this extends beyond geology. The Western Australian Craton that Brenner's team studied is home to the oldest confirmed structures left behind by single-celled organisms, stromatolites, layered mats of cyanobacteria, dated to roughly 3.48 billion years ago. Life appeared at essentially the same time as plate tectonics began. Whether this is coincidence or causation is a question that researchers are actively pursuing. The movement of tectonic plates drives the cycling of nutrients from the deep earth to the surface, creates the chemical gradients that early life could exploit, and generates the hydrothermal vent systems that many scientists believe provided the cradle for the first living cells. The machine and the biology may have been inseparable from the very beginning. But what did that world actually look like? The world in which the machine first started running? Because understanding where the supercontinent cycle began requires understanding the planet it was operating on, and that planet was so unlike the one we know that it deserves its own moment of attention. 4.5 billion years ago, immediately after the moon-forming impact, Earth's surface was a global magma ocean, not a planet with some volcanoes, not a warm world with occasional lava flows, but a sphere of liquid rock tens of miles deep, glowing red and orange in the darkness of the early solar system. The moon, freshly assembled from the debris of the collision, orbited at perhaps 1/10 of its current distance. Its gravitational pull on the magma ocean raised tidal bulges hundreds of feet high, tides of liquid rock sloshing around a planet that completed one rotation every few hours. The sky was not blue. It was orange-red, choked with vaporized rock and the thick reducing atmosphere of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and hydrogen sulfide. There was no oxygen. There was no ozone layer. The ultraviolet radiation from the young sun struck the surface unimpeded. Over the first few 100 million years, the magma ocean cooled. This happened from the top down. The surface lost heat to space faster than the deep interior. A thin crust began to form, was repeatedly shattered by the continued rain of asteroids from the still clearing early solar system, reformed, was shattered again. The period from 4.5 to 4 billion years ago is called the Hadean Eon, named for the Greek underworld, and it deserves that name. It was hell. But it was a productive hell. The differentiation of the planet was occurring, the iron and nickel sinking to form the core, the lighter silicates rising to form the mantle, and eventually the crust. The magnetic field was strengthening as the liquid outer core began to convect, and crucially, water was arriving, delivered by comets and carbonaceous asteroids from the outer solar system, accumulating in the low points of the still-forming surface, wherever temperatures were cool enough for liquid water to persist. The oldest minerals on Earth are zircon crystals from the Jack Hills of Western Australia, dated to 4.4 billion years ago. These tiny crystals, each smaller than a grain of sand, each surviving the entire subsequent history of the planet by sheer geological luck, contain chemical signatures that indicate the presence of liquid water at the surface at an extraordinarily early date. The oxygen isotope ratios within these zircons are consistent with crystallization in the presence of water. This means that even in the hellish conditions of the Hadean, there were places on Earth's surface where liquid water pooled, where rain fell from a steam-rich atmosphere, where the surface was cool enough to allow it. Not everywhere, not for long, but somewhere. And where there is liquid water, the chemistry of life becomes possible. The transition from the magma ocean to the first stable crust did not happen suddenly. It was a gradual process, punctuated by the continued bombardment of the late heavy bombardment, a period between approximately 4 billion and 3.8 billion years ago, during which the inner solar system was subjected to a dramatically elevated rate of large asteroid and comet impacts, probably triggered by gravitational instabilities in the orbits of the giant planets that sent a wave of impactors sweeping through the inner solar system. The geological evidence for this bombardment is preserved on the Moon, whose surface records it in the form of the large impact basins that give the Moon its familiar face, and in the fragmentary early rock record of Earth. By approximately 4 billion years ago, the bombardment rate had declined to something closer to the present, and the first genuinely stable pieces of continental crust were forming. These were not continents in any modern sense. They were cratons, thick, buoyant pieces of silicate crust that had been processed through enough magmatic cycles to become chemically depleted of the heavy elements that would otherwise make them dense enough to be subducted back into the mantle. Cratons, once formed, are essentially permanent features of the geological record. They are the kernels around which continents grow, and the oldest of them carry us directly to the opening of the supercontinent story. The Kaap Vaal Craton of southern Africa and the Pilbara Craton of Western Australia are two of the oldest preserved pieces of continental crust on Earth, both containing rocks that are over 3 billion years old and zircon crystals approaching 4 billion. The evidence compiled by researchers over decades of work and most recently by Brenner's team from Harvard in their March 2026 science paper, suggests that these two ancient cratons were once adjacent, forming the first coherent landmass we can identify, Vaalbara. The name is a portmanteau of Kap Vaal and Pilbara, and the assembly of Vaalbara, roughly 3.6 billion years ago, represents the first time in Earth's history that separate pieces of crust had collided and fused into something that could reasonably be called a landmass, rather than simply scattered fragments. Vaalbara was not impressive by the standards of what would come later. It was smaller than modern Australia, sitting in a vast global ocean battered by continued impactors from space, subject to volcanic activity far more intense than anything in the modern Earth. But it was there, and crucially, as the Harvard study confirms, it was moving. The magnetic fingerprints in those ancient rocks show that the Pilbara Craton and the Kap Vaal Craton were drifting relative to each other 3.5 billion years ago. The machine had started. What was life doing at this point? The answer is already quite a lot by the standards of the early Earth. Stromatolites, layered mats of cyanobacteria and other microorganisms that trap sediment and build distinctive domed or columnar structures, are found in rocks from the Pilbara Craton dated to approximately 3.5 billion years ago. These are among the oldest confirmed traces of life on Earth. Single-celled organisms were photosynthesizing, building carbonate structures, cycling sulfur and iron through the shallow marine environments of the early ocean. They were not complex. They had no nucleus, no mitochondria, no internal membrane systems. But they were alive, and they were already beginning to alter the chemistry of the world around them. The relationship between the beginning of plate tectonics and the appearance of life is one of the most actively debated questions in astrobiology. The movement of tectonic plates drives the cycling of carbon from the deep Earth to the surface through volcanism, and the removal of carbon from the atmosphere back into the mantle through subduction of carbonate-bearing oceanic crust. This carbon cycle is the planet's long-term climate thermostat. Without it, CO2 would either accumulate to toxic levels from continued volcanism or be drawn down to near zero by weathering, in either case making the planet uninhabitable over geological time. Plate tectonics also creates hydrothermal vent systems at mid-ocean ridges and subduction zones, environments that many researchers believe provided the chemical energy and the physical structure needed for the first living cells to form. The movement of the plates stirs the ocean's chemistry, delivers nutrients from the deep Earth to the shallow environments where photosynthesis occurs, and creates the geological diversity, the range of environments and chemical gradients that drives both the origin and the evolution of life. If the Harvard study's conclusion is correct, that plate tectonics was already operating 3.5 billion years ago, then life did not originate on a static, stagnant planet and only later benefit from tectonic activity. Life originated on a planet that was already in motion, already cycling its chemistry, already operating the geological machinery that would shape the next 4 billion years of biological history. The machine and the biology grew up together. Following Vaalbara, approximately 3 billion years ago, a somewhat larger continental block called Ur, assembled from several cratons including portions of southern Africa, India, Western Australia and Madagascar. Ur, named after the ancient Sumerian city by the geologist John Rogers, who first proposed its existence in a gesture toward antiquity that geologists occasionally allow themselves, was probably the first true continent in the sense of a landmass large enough to significantly affect regional climate and ocean circulation. It was still small by the standards of the supercontinents that would follow, but it was growing, and around it, the other cratons of the early Earth were also growing, accreting new material from volcanic arcs and smaller landmass collisions, slowly building the pieces that would eventually come together in a much larger assembly. The world of Vaalbara and Ur was alien in almost every respect. The oceans were warm and anoxic, devoid of free oxygen, rich in dissolved iron and sulfur. The sky was hazy and reddish, colored by methane produced by methanogenic archaea in the oxygen-free ocean. The continents themselves were dark and barren. No plants, no soil in any meaningful sense, just bare rock being slowly weathered by rain and wind. The only life was microbial, concentrated in the shallow oceans where sunlight could reach, and in the hydrothermal vent systems of the ocean floor. But microbial life, as it turns out, is sufficient to begin changing a planet. And the changes it was making would eventually trigger one of the most consequential events in the history of life on Earth. An event driven not by an asteroid or a supervolcano, but by the slow, patient chemistry of organisms too small to see, operating in a world that was about to change forever. But 3.5 billion years ago, there were no continents as we would recognize them. There were cratons, ancient, stable pieces of thick, buoyant continental crust that had solidified from the magma ocean and were too thick and too light to be pulled back into the mantle. These cratons were the seeds, the building blocks, pieces of a puzzle that had not yet found their final form. And the oldest of them has a name that feels appropriately ancient. A name drawn from two of the southern hemisphere's most geologically venerable landscapes. Vaalbara is the name given to the proposed oldest coherent landmass on Earth, assembled from the Kaapvaal Craton of southern Africa and the Pilbara Craton of Western Australia, the same ancient rocks that Brenner's team analyzed. The name is a portmanteau of the two cratons, and the identification of Vaalbara as a single coherent entity dates to work by the geologist Andrew Button in 1976. Paleomagnetic evidence suggests that these two cratons were adjacent, or at least nearby, between 3.6 and 2.8 billion years ago. This is not a supercontinent in the full sense. It is a supercraton, a piece of early continental crust large enough to leave a record, but nowhere near large enough to dominate the planet's geography. Think of it as the first sentence of a very long story. Following Vaalbara, a larger continental block called Ur, assembled approximately 3 billion years ago from several cratons including portions of what would eventually become southern Africa, India, Western Australia and Madagascar. Ur is proposed to have been the first continental fragment large enough to qualify as a genuine continent. Though not a supercontinent, it probably represented only a fraction of the total continental crust that existed at the time. Its assembly marked a significant step in the consolidation of Earth's early landmasses, and its subsequent history, incorporation into larger structures, fragmentation, reassembly, prefigures the cycles that would define the next 3 billion years. What was Earth like during this early Archean period, this world of Vaalbara and and slowly gathering continents? The picture that emerges from the geological record is one of profound strangeness by modern standards. The atmosphere contained almost no oxygen. It was dominated by nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. The sky would have appeared orange or reddish-brown, colored by methane haze and the absence of the light-scattering oxygen that gives our sky its blue. The oceans were warm, probably between 40 and 70 degrees Celsius in many regions, and were chemically unlike anything alive today, rich in dissolved iron, sulfur compounds, and other reduced minerals. The Sun was roughly 70% as luminous as it is today, the so-called faint young sun paradox. Yet the planet was not frozen, because the thick greenhouse atmosphere of CO2 and methane compensated. In this hostile, bizarre world, life was already experimenting. Stromatolites were building their laminated mats in the shallow oceans. Single-celled organisms were mastering the chemistry of survival in an environment that had no oxygen, no ozone layer to block ultraviolet radiation, and no food chains in any meaningful sense. Only chemistry and the energy to be extracted from chemical gradients. These organisms were the inheritors of whatever happened in the very first chapters of life's story, and they were the only living things on the planet for most of its history up to this point. But they were sufficient. They were making their living, and they were, without knowing it, setting the stage for something that would eventually kill most of them. Knorland, the first supercontinent. 2.7 billion years ago, something changed. The pace of continental growth accelerated dramatically. The cratons that had been drifting slowly across the early ocean began colliding with each other at rates that left enormous mountain belts, called orogens, in the geological record. These are the Knorren orogens, named for the Lake District of northern Ontario, where their remnants were first studied, and they record one of the most significant geological events in the first half of Earth's history: the assembly of Knorland. Knorland was not modest. It incorporated what would eventually become the core of North America, the Superior Craton, the largest Archean craton on Earth, along with Greenland, the Baltic Shield of Scandinavia, and portions of what is now southern Africa. It was a genuine supercontinent, or at least a supercraton of substantial size, assembled through the collision of multiple previously separate landmasses, in a process that would have been recognizable to any modern geologist. Mountains rose where the cratons collided. Shallow seas flooded the margins. Volcanic arcs added new material to the growing landmass. The machine was operating, and here is the first connection between the supercontinent cycle and the fate of life. Because when Knorland existed, during the late Archean and into the early Proterozoic, the atmosphere was still largely anoxic. The tiny amount of oxygen produced by photosynthesizing cyanobacteria was immediately consumed by the abundant dissolved iron in the oceans, which reacted with the oxygen and precipitated out as iron oxides. The banded iron formations that fill museum cases worldwide and account for most of the world's iron ore. The ocean acted as a chemical sponge, mopping up every molecule of oxygen before it could accumulate in the atmosphere. The world was in chemical equilibrium. Unstable, perhaps, but steady. The pace of that change is difficult to appreciate without context. Geologists measure the rate of crustal growth by looking at the frequency of mountain-building events, orogenies, recorded in the rock record. The Archean Eon, from 4 to 2.5 billion years ago, shows a dramatic acceleration in orogeny rates around 2.7 billion years ago, suggesting that something fundamental about the behavior of the tectonic system shifted at that time. The most widely accepted explanation is that this represents the onset of modern-style subduction, the process by which one tectonic plate dives beneath another, pulling the surface plate into the mantle and driving the plate motion that builds continents. Before approximately 2.7 billion years ago, the evidence suggests that the tectonic system operated differently, perhaps more like the episodic or sluggish lid models that Brenner's team's work implies for the even earlier Earth, in which plates moved, but not in the organized, continuous fashion of modern plate tectonics. The transition to something like the modern system around 2.7 billion years ago, with proper subduction zones, volcanic arcs, and the systematic growth of continental crust through the addition of arc materials to the craton margins, is one of the most significant transitions in the geological record of the Archean. It is the moment when the machine shifted gears. The assembly of Kenorland was the first product of this shifted gear. The collisions that built it left enormous mountain ranges, the Kenoran origins, whose roots can still be traced in the ancient basement rocks of North America, Greenland, Scandinavia, and southern Africa today. Picture a mountain range the size of the modern Himalayas stretching across what is now northern Canada, its peaks perhaps reaching 5 or 6 miles above sea level, its roots depressing the mantle beneath it for hundreds of miles. These were not gentle hills. They were the products of continent-continent collisions, driven by the full force of mantle convection, and their construction consumed millions of years and released enormous amounts of heat and volcanic material into the atmosphere and ocean. The oceans surrounding Kenorland were still anoxic, still rich in dissolved iron, still chemically reducing, still hostile to any organism that depended on free oxygen. The atmosphere above them was still dominated by nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane. The sun was approximately 25% less luminous than it is today, but the biological world was not standing still. The cyanobacteria, the photosynthesizing bacteria that produce oxygen as a byproduct of splitting water molecules to extract hydrogen for biosynthesis, had been present since at least 3.5 billion years ago. For over 1 billion years, they had been releasing oxygen into their environment, only to have it immediately consumed by the vast quantities of dissolved iron in the ocean. The iron acted as a chemical buffer, converting every molecule of oxygen into iron oxide and preventing any accumulation in the atmosphere. The banded iron formations that record this process, those beautiful striped rocks of alternating red iron-rich and grey iron-poor layers, are found on every continent and represent one of the most voluminous sedimentary deposits in Earth's geological record. But a chemical buffer is not unlimited. Over hundreds of millions of years, the cyanobacteria were slowly oxidizing the dissolved iron in the ocean, pulling it out of solution and depositing it as iron oxide on the seafloor. As Kenorland assembled and then began to rift apart, the vast new, shallow coastal environments created by the rifting gave the cyanobacteria expanded habitats for explosive population growth. Photosynthesis rates surged, and at approximately 2.4 billion years ago, the iron buffer was finally exhausted in the shallow oceans. The oxygen had nowhere left to go but up. The Great Oxidation Event, sometimes called the oxygen catastrophe, though catastrophe depends very much on your perspective, was not a sudden event. It unfolded over millions of years as oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere rose from essentially 0 to perhaps 1 to 2%, still far below the 21% of the modern atmosphere, but sufficient to fundamentally transform the chemistry of the world. For the anaerobic organisms that had dominated Earth's biosphere for over 2 billion years, it was a catastrophe in the most literal sense. Oxygen is a powerful oxidant. It reacts readily with the organic molecules that make up living cells, and organisms that had evolved in its absence had no biochemical defenses against it. Most of the dominant life forms of the Archean world were poisoned by the oxygen they could not tolerate. This was the first mass extinction in Earth's history, not caused by an asteroid, not caused by a volcanic eruption, caused by biology, by the metabolic byproduct of organisms too small to see, produced in such quantities over such an extended period that the chemistry of the entire planetary atmosphere was transformed. The irony is profound. The organisms that caused the extinction did not suffer from it. The cyanobacteria were oxygen-producing aerobic organisms by definition. It was their competitors, the anaerobes that had dominated the Archean Ocean, who were destroyed. The survivors, both those that found refuge in anoxic environments where oxygen never reached, and those that evolved the biochemical machinery to not only tolerate but exploit the new oxygen-rich atmosphere, inherited a transformed world. And among the exploiters of oxygen, over hundreds of millions of years, would eventually arise the eukaryotes, cells with a membrane-bound nucleus and, crucially, mitochondria, former free-living bacteria that had been incorporated as internal symbionts and repurposed as oxygen-burning energy factories. The mitochondria gave eukaryotic cells an energy metabolism orders of magnitude more powerful than anything available to prokaryotes. They are the reason that complex multicellular life, animals, plants, fungi, exists. And their origin is inseparable from the Great Oxidation Event that the breakup of Kenorland helped trigger. The Huronian glaciation followed almost immediately after the Great Oxidation Event, beginning approximately 2.4 billion years ago and lasting for roughly 300 million years, potentially the longest glaciation in Earth's history. The mechanism linking the two events involves methane. Before the Great Oxidation Event, the atmosphere contained substantial concentrations of methane produced by methanogenic archaea, living in the anoxic ocean and wetland environments. Methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and its presence in the Archean atmosphere helped compensate for the faint young sun. Without it, the planet would have been permanently frozen long before the Great Oxidation Event occurred. When oxygen began accumulating in the atmosphere, it reacted with and destroyed the methane, removing this greenhouse gas and dramatically reducing the warming effect of the atmosphere. The planet cooled catastrophically. Ice advanced from the poles toward the equator, in what may have been another Snowball Earth or near Snowball event, lasting until volcanic CO2 gradually accumulated to sufficient levels to restart the greenhouse effect. Life survived the Huronian glaciation in the same way it had survived earlier crises and would survive later ones. In refugia, in the deep ocean, in the hydrothermal vents, in whatever liquid water remained accessible beneath the ice. The organisms that emerged from the other side of the glaciation were not the same as those that had entered it. The anoxic world of the Archean was gone. The oxygenated world of the Proterozoic was beginning. And on the cratons that had survived the ice, the slow work of assembling the next supercontinent was already underway. Then Kenorland began to break apart. The timing is approximate, somewhere between 2.5 and 2.1 billion years ago. But the consequences were not approximate at all. When the supercontinent rifted, it created vast new shallow coastal environments. The shallow seas that flooded the rifting margins were precisely the environments where cyanobacteria thrived most productively. Photosynthesis accelerated, oxygen production surged, and critically, the rifting and the weathering of newly exposed rock consumed the dissolved iron in the shallow oceans faster than it could be replenished, destroying the chemical sponge that had been absorbing oxygen for billions of years. The result was the Great Oxidation Event, approximately 2.4 billion years ago. Oxygen, poison to the anaerobic organisms that had dominated Earth's biosphere for over 2 billion years, began accumulating in the atmosphere for the first time in the planet's history. The geological record of this event is dramatic and unmistakable. The banded iron formations that had been depositing continuously for hundreds of millions of years abruptly stopped. Red beds, rocks colored by the oxidation of iron into rust, appeared for the first time. Sulfate concentrations in the oceans rose sharply as sulfur was oxidized. And the biosphere experienced what many researchers call the first mass extinction in Earth's history, as the anaerobic organisms that had ruled the planet were poisoned by the atmospheric oxygen they had never encountered. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. The Great Oxidation Event was not caused by an asteroid. It was not caused by a volcanic eruption. It was caused by a shift in the arrangement of continents, by the breakup of a supercontinent creating the conditions under which photosynthetic life could finally overwhelm the chemical buffers that had kept oxygen out of the atmosphere for 2 billion years. The very geology of the planet, in its slow motion, reshuffled the chemistry of the world and killed most of the life in it. This is the pattern that will repeat in different forms and through different mechanisms every time a supercontinent assembles or disassembles. The aftermath of the Great Oxidation Event included another consequence that connects directly to a story we have told before on this channel. The oxygen buildup drew down atmospheric methane, a far more potent greenhouse gas, and triggered a global glaciation. The Huronian glaciation, lasting roughly 300 million years, may have been the longest ice age in Earth's history, and possibly an early version of a Snowball Earth event. The breakup of Kinnorland did not just kill the dominant life forms of the Archean, it froze the planet. But life persisted. It always does. And in the aftermath of the glaciation, with a newly oxygenated atmosphere and oceans that were slowly being transformed by the presence of this reactive gas, the stage was set for the next chapter. Columbia. The boring billion that wasn't here is a phrase that geologists used for decades to describe the period between roughly 1.8 and 800 million years ago. The boring billion. The implication was clear. Not much happened. The continents assembled into a supercontinent called Columbia, or Nuna, sat there for a few 100 million years, then broke apart, and biology mostly marked time. Single-celled life, not much innovation, nothing to write home about. That characterization is now understood to be spectacularly wrong, and the correction of that misunderstanding is one of the most interesting scientific revisions of the past decade. Columbia assembled approximately 1.8 billion years ago through a series of continental collisions that left mountain belts on virtually every major continental fragment we can recognize today. The Trans-Hudson origin in North America, the Capricorn origin in Australia, the Svekofenian origin in Scandinavia, the Ubendian belt in Africa. These are all scars from the collisions that built Columbia. At its maximum extent, Columbia may have been the largest supercontinent Earth had ever seen to that point, stretching from pole to pole and incorporating nearly all the continental crust that existed at the time. The Trans-Hudson origin of North America is one of the most studied ancient mountain belts on Earth, precisely because it is so well preserved and so accessible. Stretching from what is now Montana and Wyoming northward through Saskatchewan and Manitoba to Hudson Bay and beyond into Greenland, it records the collision of the Superior Craton, the largest piece of Archean crust in North America, with the Wyoming Craton to the south and the Hearn and Ray Cratons to the north. This collision, occurring approximately 1.8 billion years ago, was the closing act of the assembly of Columbia's North American core, and it produced mountains that may have rivaled the modern Alps in height. Their deeply eroded roots form the basement of the Canadian Shield today, the ancient, stable heart of the continent that has been geologically quiet for over 1 billion years. Similar belts of the same age appear on every other major continent. The Capricorn origin in Western Australia records the collision of the Pilbara and Yilgarn cratons, same ancient blocks that carry the world's oldest rocks. The Svekofenian origin of Scandinavia records the assembly of the Baltic Shield. The Ubendian belt of East Africa and the Limpopo belt of Southern Africa record collisions on the African cratons. The Aravalli belt of India records the assembly of the Indian craton. On every continent, the same signature: mountain belts approximately 1.8 billion years old, recording a global episode of continental collision that built a single enormous landmass. At its maximum extent, Columbia may have been the largest supercontinent that had ever existed, a landmass stretching from what is now northwestern Canada through Scandinavia to Western Australia to India to Antarctica, incorporating perhaps 80 to 90% of all the continental crust that existed at the time. The ocean surrounding it, geologists call it the Mirovia or Mirovoi, from the Russian for world ocean, was a single global body of water with circulation patterns unlike anything in the modern ocean. Because the continental configuration that drives modern ocean circulation did not exist. And life, during Columbia's long tenure, was making the transition that would eventually produce everything we see around us today. The eukaryotic cell, with its nuclear membrane, its mitochondria, its cytoskeleton, its capacity for the kind of complex internal organization that makes differentiated multicellular life possible, was diversifying and experimenting. The oldest unambiguous eukaryotic fossils date to approximately 1.8 to 2 billion years ago, right at the time of Columbia's assembly. These early eukaryotes were still single-celled, still microscopic, still living in the shallow marine environments of the continental margins. But they carried within them the architectural innovations that would, hundreds of millions of years later, produce the first animals. The question of why eukaryotes evolved when they did, why the transition from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cellular organization occurred at approximately this time in Earth's history and not earlier or later, has occupied biologists and geophysicists for decades. The most compelling answers connect eukaryotic origins to the chemical changes in the ocean and atmosphere that followed the Great Oxidation Event, and were further modified by the assembly and eventual breakup of Columbia. Eukaryotic cells require oxygen. The mitochondria that power them are oxygen-burning organelles. Without the Great Oxidation Event raising atmospheric oxygen levels, the eukaryotic cell could not have evolved in its current form. And without the changes in ocean chemistry associated with Columbia's breakup, the specific redox conditions that promoted the evolution of complex cellular organization may not have developed. The breakup of Columbia, beginning approximately 1.5 billion years ago, is where the 2025 research from the University of Sydney makes its most significant contribution. The process of rifting, of a supercontinent tearing itself apart along zones of weakness in the lithosphere, involves the formation of rift basins, the thinning of continental crust, and the eventual opening of new ocean basins as the continental fragments separate. This process is accompanied by volcanism, as the thinning crust allows mantle material to reach the surface, and by the formation of new oceanic crust at the spreading centers that develop along the rifts. What Dutkiewicz and her colleagues found was that the particular style of Columbia's rifting, the specific geometry of how it broke apart, had an unusual effect on the rate of CO2 release from volcanism. Normally, the formation of new oceanic crust at spreading ridges is one of the primary sources of volcanic CO2 in the long-term carbon cycle. But the Columbia rifting pattern, as the team reconstructed it, involved less ridge spreading than might be expected, reducing the volcanic CO2 input to the atmosphere. Simultaneously, the fresh rock exposed by the rifting was subject to rapid chemical weathering in the warm, wet conditions of the mid-Proterozoic, consuming atmospheric CO2 and delivering the weathering products, calcium and magnesium bicarbonates, to the ocean. The dual effect was a reduction in atmospheric CO2 and a fundamental shift in ocean chemistry, particularly in the concentration of dissolved oxygen in shallow marine environments. The result was that the shallow oceans of the mid-Proterozoic became, for the first time in Earth's history, significantly oxygenated, not to the levels of the modern ocean, but sufficiently to begin selecting for organisms that could exploit the energetic advantages of aerobic metabolism at the cellular level. This was the chemical environment in which the eukaryotic cell diversified, in which the first evidence of sexual reproduction appears in the fossil record, approximately 1.2 billion years ago, and in which the slow accumulation of the biological innovations that would eventually produce multicellular animals began. It is worth stepping back to appreciate what we are describing. The breakup of a supercontinent 1.5 billion years ago changed the chemistry of the shallow ocean, which changed the selective pressures on single-celled organisms, which over hundreds of millions of years drove the evolution of the eukaryotic cell, which eventually produced the first animals, which eventually produced us. A tectonic event that no organism living at the time could have perceived. A slow separation of land masses over tens of millions of years set in motion a chain of biological consequences that is still unfolding today. This is what it means to say that the supercontinent cycle is the operating system of the planet. It does not merely rearrange the geography, it rewrites the rules of biology. What was life doing during Columbia's long tenure? The answer, it turns out, is rather more than the boring billion label suggests. The first eukaryotes, cells with a membrane-bound nucleus, the architectural innovation that makes complex life possible, appear in the fossil record approximately 1.8 to 2 billion years ago. The timing of this appearance is not coincidental with respect to the supercontinent. The assembly of Columbia would have dramatically altered ocean circulation patterns, nutrient availability in coastal environments, and the chemical composition of the ocean itself. These changes created new selective pressures and new opportunities. The eukaryotic cell, with its nuclear membrane and its mitochondria, and eventually its chloroplasts, all acquired through the incorporation of bacterial symbionts, was in part a response to a world whose chemistry was changing under the influence of the new continental configuration. Columbia persisted for roughly 300 million years before beginning to break apart approximately 1.5 billion years ago. And it is the breakup that research published in late 2025 has now identified as a pivotal moment in the history of life. A team from the University of Sydney, led by Professor Adriana Dutkiewicz, analyzed the tectonic history of the Columbia breakup and its effects on ocean chemistry and atmospheric CO2. Their findings showed that the fragmentation of Columbia had a dual effect. It reduced the rate of volcanic carbon dioxide release that normally accompanies the formation of oceanic crust at rifting margins, while simultaneously enhancing the weathering of newly exposed continental rock, which consumed atmospheric CO2. The net effect was a cooling of Earth's climate and a fundamental alteration of ocean chemistry, specifically an increase in dissolved oxygen in the shallow oceans, that created precisely the conditions needed for the evolution of more complex multicellular life. In other words, the breakup of Columbia may have made the evolution of complex life not just possible, but inevitable. The boring billion was not boring at all. It was the slow chemical preparation of a planet for a biological revolution that would come later. The patience of geology operating on scales that make human history look like a blink. The fragmentation of Columbia eventually produced a new configuration of continents that would persist for several 100 million years before the next great assembly. But the continental pieces were already being drawn toward each other again by the inexorable physics of mantle convection, the slow churning of the hot mantle beneath the crust that drives the plates at the surface. And roughly 1.1 billion years ago, they began to converge on a new arrangement. Rodinia, the supercontinent that froze the world. Rodinia. The name comes from the Russian word for homeland, Rodina, and it was coined in 1990 by the American geologist Mark McMenamin, who had a flair for the evocative. As a name for a supercontinent, it is fitting. Rodinia was, in a sense, the homeland of all subsequent continents. Its assembly, its configuration, and above all its catastrophic breakup set in motion a chain of consequences that shaped the biosphere for hundreds of millions of years and led, through a series of extraordinary events, to the explosion of complex animal life. Rodinia assembled approximately 1.1 billion years ago through the Grenville orogeny, one of the largest and longest mountain-building episodes in Earth's history, whose remnants can be traced in rocks from what is now Mexico through the Appalachian Highlands to Labrador, and correlating belts on every other major continent. Laurentia, the ancient core of North America, including Greenland, sat at the center of Rodinia. Around it, the other major continental blocks had been sutured: Amazonia and the West African Craton on one side, Baltica and Siberia on another, Australia, India, East Antarctica, and the Congo Craton completing the assembly. The result was a single landmass of enormous extent, stretching through the tropics, with the Grenville Mountains at its heart, towering to heights that may have rivaled the modern Himalayas. The Grenville orogeny was not a single collision, but a series of them, unfolding over roughly 250 million years, between approximately 1.3 and 1.0 billion years ago. The mountain belts it produced stretched for over 12,000 miles around the perimeter of the assembling supercontinent, longer than the modern circumference of the Earth at the equator. Their remnants are preserved today in the Grenville province of eastern Canada and the Adirondack Mountains of New York, in correlating belts in Scotland and Scandinavia, in the eastern Ghats of India, In the Namakwa natal belt of southern Africa, in the Albany-Fraser origin of Australia, and in the Musgrave province at the centre of the Australian continent. Every one of these ancient mountain routes, now worn to low hills or buried beneath younger sediments, marks a suture, a place where two continental fragments collided and fused during the assembly of Rodinia. The interior of Rodinia, once fully assembled, was a landscape of extremes. The Grenville Mountains at its heart had been reduced over tens of millions of years to rugged highlands, their peaks still significant, but their former grandeur diminished by erosion. The coastal margins of the supercontinent, where the shallow seas of the surrounding ocean lapped against the continental shelves, hosted the most biologically productive environments on the planet. Stromatolite reefs built by cyanobacterial communities, shallow carbonate platforms, accumulating the calcium carbonate that the warming ocean could no longer hold in solution, and the increasingly diverse communities of single-celled eukaryotes that had been evolving since the Columbia breakup had improved ocean chemistry. In these shallow coastal waters, something genuinely new was beginning to experiment. The evidence is fragmentary and contested, as nearly all evidence from this remote period necessarily is. But several fossil sites from rocks approximately 1.2 to 1 billion years old preserve structures that some researchers interpret as the earliest multicellular organisms with differentiated cell types. Bangiomorpha pubescens, a red alga from the Canadian Arctic dated to approximately 1 billion years ago, is arguably the oldest fossil that preserves clear evidence of cellular differentiation, different cell types performing different functions within a single organism, the defining characteristic of multicellular life as distinct from colonial single-celled life. If this identification is correct, then the first genuinely multicellular organisms appeared during the tenure of Rodinia, in the chemically transformed ocean that Columbia's breakup had helped create. The breakup of Rodinia, beginning approximately 750 million years ago, did not happen along the same boundaries where the supercontinent had been assembled. This is a general feature of the supercontinent cycle that geologists have noted repeatedly. Continents do not tend to break apart along the same sutures where they were joined. The sutures, where two cratons collided and fused, are actually the strongest parts of the lithosphere, because the collision welded them together, and the erosion of the mountains above them delivered dense sediment that loaded and strengthened the crust. The rifting typically initiates in the interior of the old continental blocks, where ancient thermal anomalies in the mantle, plumes of abnormally hot mantle material rising from depth, weaken the lithosphere from below. Rodinia's breakup was driven by exactly this mechanism, with mantle plumes beneath Laurentia and its neighbors providing the thermal energy to thin and ultimately tear the overlying crust. The rifting proceeded in stages, separating Rodinia's fragments over tens of millions of years. Laurentia, the future North America, became isolated as its former neighbors drifted away, leaving it ringed by passive margins, the geological signatures of continental rifting, where the crust has been thinned and the continental edge subsided to form a platform below sea level. The passive margins of Laurentia that formed during the Rodinia breakup can still be traced in the rock record of the Appalachian region of North America, where they were later overprinted by the collisions that built the Appalachian Mountains during the assembly of Pangea. The consequence of these fresh, passive margins for the carbon cycle was immediate and dramatic. Passive margins are sites of intense silicate weathering. The fresh rock exposed by rifting and the sediments transported from the elevated continental interior to the coastal zones are subject to chemical attack by the rainfall that the warm cryogenian climate delivered in abundance. Every molecule of CO2 consumed by silicate weathering is a molecule removed from the atmospheric greenhouse. And with most of Rodinia's fragments positioned in the tropics, in the zone of maximum rainfall and maximum weathering intensity, the consumption of atmospheric CO2 was extraordinary. The greenhouse weakened, the planet cooled, and as we have discussed in a previous episode, the ice albedo feedback took the cooling to an extreme that has not been equaled since. The life that emerged from the Snowball Earth events of the cryogenian was fundamentally different from the life that had entered them. The extreme environmental stress, the near total freeze of the ocean, the near elimination of photosynthesis for tens of millions of years, the extraordinary chemical richness of the post-glacial ocean had acted as the most powerful evolutionary filter in the history of complex life. What survived were the most metabolically versatile, physiologically most stress-tolerant organisms. What emerged into the post-snowball world were organisms carrying innovations in cell structure, in metabolic pathways, in the capacity for multicellular organization that had been tested by conditions no subsequent generation of organisms has ever faced. The Ediacaran fauna that appeared after the Marinoan deglaciation were the first expression of what those innovations could produce. Dickinsonia and Kimberella and Charnia and their strange companions in the fossil record of 600 to 540 million years ago represent not a failed experiment, but a necessary prologue, the first draft of the animal body plan, written in the chemically rich, ecologically empty ocean of the post-snowball world, tested by conditions of extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary stress, and ultimately superseded by the more elaborate drafts of the Cambrian explosion. The breakup of Rodinia did not merely trigger a glaciation. It cleared the biological slate and invited the writing of a new story. Now here is where Rodinia's story becomes one of the most consequential in the entire history of the planet, because the configuration of Rodinia created a geographic trap, a set of conditions that would eventually feed back on each other until the planet's climate reached the most extreme state it has ever known. The key is the location of the continents. Rodinia was positioned predominantly in the tropics, and tropical continents exposed to intense rainfall at low latitudes weather rapidly. Silicate weathering, the chemical reaction between rainwater, which is mildly acidic from dissolved CO2, and silicate rocks, consumes atmospheric carbon dioxide and eventually transfers it to the ocean as dissolved carbonate, where it gets buried in sediments on the ocean floor. This is one of the primary long-term mechanisms by which Earth regulates its climate, a geological thermostat that has kept the planet habitable for billions of years. Under normal circumstances, when CO2 rises, temperatures warm, rainfall increases, weathering accelerates, CO2 gets drawn down, and the climate cools. A negative feedback that keeps things within habitable bounds. But Rodinia was not a normal circumstance. With most of the continental mass sitting in the tropics, the weathering rate was already high. And when Rodinia began to break apart, approximately 750 million years ago, rifting apart along what are now the edges of Laurentia and its former neighbors, the rifting process exposed enormous new surfaces of fresh silicate rock to the tropical atmosphere. Weathering accelerated further. CO2 was drawn down at an extraordinary rate. The greenhouse effect weakened. Temperatures began to fall. And then the ice albedo feedback took over. As ice expanded from the poles toward the tropics, it reflected more incoming sunlight back to space. The planet cooled further. More ice formed. The feedback amplified itself until, as we discussed in our episode on ice ages, the planet reached the Snowball Earth state, with ice covering the ocean from pole to equator. Rodinia broke itself. The very act of its disassembly, by positioning fresh rock in the tropical weathering zone and driving CO2 to catastrophically low levels, triggered the most extreme glaciations in Earth's history. The Sturtian glaciation began approximately 717 million years ago and lasted 50 million years. The Marinoan glaciation followed 650 million years ago. Together, they constitute the Cryogenian period, and together they nearly ended the story of complex life before it had properly begun. Nearly, but not quite. Because, as we have discussed, life persisted in the refugia of the frozen world, in hydrothermal vents, in subglacial lakes, in thin equatorial ice. And when the volcanic CO2 that had been accumulating over 50 million years finally overwhelmed the ice albedo feedback and the glaciation collapsed, the world that emerged on the other side was one of extraordinary opportunity. The post-snowball ocean was a chemical feast, rich in dissolved minerals accumulated over millions of years of volcanic input without biological consumption. The ecological niches that had been occupied by the pre-snowball biosphere were now largely vacant. And into that empty world, life stepped with a new configuration that had never been seen before. The Ediacaran fauna, those strange, quilted and frond-like organisms that constitute the first recognizable complex multicellular life, appear in the fossil record immediately after the Marinoan deglaciation. The Cambrian explosion follows 300 million years later. The connection between Rodinia's self-destruction and the evolution of complex animal life is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the supercontinent cycle operating at its most extreme. There is a brief and contested chapter between Rodinia and Pangea that deserves mention, even though it remains scientifically disputed. Some researchers propose the existence of a short-lived supercontinent called Pannotia, assembling approximately 600 million years ago from the fragments of Rodinia and persisting for perhaps 20 million years before breaking apart again. The evidence for Pannotia is less robust than for the other supercontinents in our story, The paleomagnetic data is ambiguous, and some geologists argue that the continental configurations described as Pannotia simply represent a transitional phase between Rodinia and the Gondwana-Laurasia world that preceded Pangea. But the debate itself is instructive. It tells us something important about the nature of the supercontinent cycle. It is not a clockwork mechanism with perfectly regular intervals and clearly defined states. It is a complex, non-linear process that sometimes produces clear supercontinents and sometimes produces messy transitional configurations that resist easy classification. What is not disputed is that by approximately 540 million years ago, the continental fragments that had been part of Rodinia were arranged in a configuration that would eventually lead to two distinct supercontinents, one in the south and one eventually in the north, before they reunited into the last supercontinent most people have heard of, Gondwana, the southern giant. The word Gondwana comes from a region of central India, the Gondwana region of Madhya Pradesh, where a geologist named Edward Suess in the 1880s recognized a distinctive suite of rock formations and fossils that appeared to link India, Africa, South America, Antarctica, and Australia into a single ancient landmass. Suess called this hypothetical southern continent Gondwana land, later shortened to Gondwana. And while Suess had no mechanism for how such a vast landmass could have fragmented and dispersed across the globe, plate tectonics would not be understood for another 80 years. His intuition was correct. Gondwana assembled from the fragments of Rodinia between approximately 600 and 500 million years ago, through a series of collisions that geologists call the Pan-African orogeny. It was a supercontinent of the southern hemisphere, centered roughly around what is now Antarctica, with Africa, South America, the Arabian Peninsula, India, Australia, and various smaller fragments arrayed around it. At its maximum extent, Gondwana covered roughly 100 million square kilometers, comparable in area to a modern supercontinent and larger than any single landmass on Earth today by an enormous margin. The mountain roots of the Grenville are the geological receipts of that assembly, one collision after another, written in rock on every continent, readable by anyone who knows the language. The interior of Rodinia, once fully assembled, was a landscape of extremes. The Grenville Mountains at its heart had been reduced over tens of millions of years to rugged highlands, their peaks still significant, but their former grandeur diminished by erosion. The coastal margins of the supercontinent, where the shallow seas of the surrounding ocean lapped against the continental shelves, hosted the most biologically productive environments on the planet. Stromatolite reefs built by cyanobacterial communities, shallow carbonate platforms, accumulating the calcium carbonate that the warming ocean could no longer hold in solution, and the increasingly diverse communities of single-celled eukaryotes that had been evolving since the Columbia breakup had improved ocean chemistry. In these shallow coastal waters, something genuinely new was beginning to experiment. The evidence is fragmentary and contested, as nearly all evidence from this remote period necessarily is, but several fossil sites from rocks approximately 1.2 to 1 billion years old preserve structures that some researchers interpret as the earliest multicellular organisms with differentiated cell types. Bangiomorpha pubescens, a red alga from the Canadian Arctic dated to approximately 1 billion years ago, is arguably the oldest fossil that preserves clear evidence of cellular differentiation. Different cell types performing different functions within a single organism, the defining characteristic of multicellular life as distinct from colonial single-celled life. If this identification is correct, then the first genuinely multicellular organisms appeared during the tenure of Rodinia, in the chemically transformed ocean that Columbia's breakup had helped create. The breakup of Rodinia, beginning approximately 750 million years ago, did not happen along the same boundaries where the supercontinent had been assembled. This is a general feature of the supercontinent cycle that geologists have noted repeatedly. Continents do not tend to break apart along the same sutures where they were joined. The sutures, where two cratons collided and fused, are actually the strongest parts of the lithosphere, because the collision welded them together and the erosion of the mountains above them delivered dense sediment that loaded and strengthened the crust. The rifting typically initiates in the interior of the old continental blocks, where ancient thermal anomalies in the mantle, plumes of abnormally hot mantle material rising from depth, weaken the lithosphere from below. Rodinia's breakup was driven by exactly this mechanism, with mantle plumes beneath Laurentia and its neighbors providing the thermal energy to thin and ultimately tear the overlying crust. The rifting proceeded in stages, separating Rodinia's fragments over tens of millions of years. Laurentia, the future North America, became isolated as its former neighbors drifted away, leaving it ringed by passive margins, the geological signatures of continental rifting, where the crust has been thinned and the continental edge subsided to form a platform below sea level. The passive margins of Laurentia that formed during the Rodinia breakup can still be traced in the rock record of the Appalachian region of North America, where they were later overprinted by the collisions that built the Appalachian Mountains during the assembly of Pangea. The consequence of these fresh passive margins for the carbon cycle was immediate and dramatic. Passive margins are sites of intense silicate weathering, the fresh rock exposed by rifting and the sediments transported from the elevated continental interior to the coastal zones are subject to chemical attack by the rainfall that the warm cryogenian climate delivered in abundance. Every molecule of CO2 consumed by silicate weathering is a molecule removed from the atmospheric greenhouse. And with most of Rodinia's fragments positioned in the tropics, in the zone of maximum rainfall and maximum weathering intensity, the consumption of atmospheric CO2 was extraordinary. The greenhouse weakened, the planet cooled, and, as we have discussed in a previous episode, the ice albedo feedback took the cooling to an extreme that has not been equaled since. The life that emerged from the Snowball Earth events of the Cryogenian was fundamentally different from the life that had entered them. The extreme environmental stress, the near total freeze of the ocean, the near elimination of photosynthesis for tens of millions of years, the extraordinary chemical richness of the post-glacial ocean, had acted as the most powerful evolutionary filter in the history of complex life. What survived were the most metabolically versatile, physiologically most stress-tolerant organisms. What emerged into the post-snowball world were organisms carrying innovations in cell structure, in metabolic pathways, in the capacity for multicellular organization that had been tested by conditions no subsequent generation of organisms has ever faced. The Ediacaran fauna that appeared after the Marinoan deglaciation were the first expression of what those innovations could produce. Dickinsonia and Kimberella and Charnia and their strange companions in the fossil record of 600 to 540 million years ago represent not a failed experiment, but a necessary prologue, the first draft of the animal body plan, written in the chemically rich, ecologically empty ocean of the post-snowball world, tested by conditions of extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary stress, and ultimately superseded by the more elaborate drafts of the Cambrian explosion. The breakup of Rodinia did not merely trigger a glaciation. It cleared the biological slate and invited the writing of a new story. Here is something that changes how you look at the world. The assembly of Gondwana through the Pan-African orogeny was one of the most geologically complex events of the Neoproterozoic and early Paleozoic, involving not 2 or 3 continental fragments, but a dozen or more, each following its own trajectory across the ancient ocean floors before collision. The East African origin, the mountain belt that records the suturing of East and West Gondwana, stretched for over 6,000 miles from what is now Mozambique through eastern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and into the Himalayan region of Pakistan and India. It was larger than any mountain belt in the modern world, and its deeply eroded remnants form the basement of half a continent. Gondwana sat predominantly over the South Pole for much of the Paleozoic era, the 540 to 252 million year span that encompasses the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous and Permian periods. This polar position had profound consequences for Gondwanan climate and for the evolution of life on the supercontinent. During the late Ordovician, approximately 445 million years ago, Gondwana passed directly over the South Pole, triggering a major glaciation, the Hunantian glaciation, that has been linked to the second largest mass extinction in Earth's history, the late Ordovician extinction, which eliminated approximately 85% of marine species. The mechanism was the same as in all glaciation-linked extinctions. Ice sheets formed on the southern landmass. Sea levels fell as water was locked up in ice. The shallow marine environments that hosted most of the world's biodiversity were drained, and the ocean chemistry shifted in ways that favored few of the organisms adapted to the warm, stable Ordovician seas. But Gondwana was also an extraordinary cradle of biological innovation. The Cambrian explosion of animal body plans, which we have discussed in our episode on Snowball Earth, occurred on the margins of the Gondwanan fragments and their neighbors, in the shallow seas of the early Paleozoic. The subsequent radiation of marine invertebrates, fish, and eventually land plants and land animals was in large part a Gondwanan story. The first vascular plants colonized the land approximately 430 million years ago in what is now Gondwanan rock. The Silurian and Devonian floras of South America, Southern Africa, Australia, and Antarctica preserve the earliest evidence of plant colonization of terrestrial environments that would transform the planet's carbon cycle, oxygen levels, and the physical character of the land surface. The Devonian period, the age of fishes that we have discussed before, was largely a Gondwanan world in terms of its most dramatic biological events. The placoderms, the jawless fish, the first lobe-finned fish whose descendants would eventually crawl onto land, all evolved and diversified in and around the shallow seas of the Gondwanan margins. Tiktaalik, the transitional form between fish and tetrapods that represents one of the most dramatic steps in the history of vertebrate life, lived in what is now the Canadian Arctic, but that region was at the time a tropical coastal environment on the northern margin of a Gondwana-dominated world, its geology reflecting the same Devonian age that characterizes the crucial transitional fossils of the vertebrate conquest of land. The Carboniferous period brought Gondwana into one of its most biologically significant configurations, the supercontinent's northern margin, where the forests of what are now South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India covered vast lowland swamps, produced the coal measures that fuel a significant fraction of the world's electricity today. Those Carboniferous forests were extraordinary ecosystems, dominated by giant leucopsid trees up to 30 meters tall, their trunks more than a meter in diameter, growing in dense stands in the warm, humid coastal environments of Gondwana's northern margin. The insects that inhabited those forests, in an atmosphere with oxygen concentrations approaching 35%, produced by the massive photosynthetic output of the coal forests, reached sizes that have never been exceeded. Dragonflies with wingspans of 70 centimeters, millipedes 2 meters long, scorpions larger than domestic cats. The physical constraints on insect size are primarily set by the passive diffusion of oxygen through the tracheal system. More oxygen in the atmosphere means larger maximum body size, and the Carboniferous atmosphere had more oxygen than at any subsequent time in Earth's history. The Carboniferous coal forests also produced, indirectly, one of the most significant climate events of the Paleozoic. The lignin in the woody tissues of those trees, the structural polymer that gives wood its strength and rigidity, was a new biological molecule, and the fungi and bacteria that decompose dead wood had not yet evolved the enzymes to break it down efficiently. The result was that dead trees in the Carboniferous swamps did not fully decompose. They accumulated, layer upon layer of partially decomposed wood, preserved from complete breakdown by the anaerobic conditions of the waterlogged swamps, was buried under sediment and eventually transformed into coal. This process removed enormous quantities of carbon from the atmosphere, carbon that the trees had extracted from atmospheric CO2 through photosynthesis and then failed to return through decomposition. Atmospheric CO2 fell dramatically over the course of the Carboniferous, contributing to a major glaciation of the Gondwanan polar regions, the Karoo Ice Age, that lasted from approximately 360 to 260 million years ago, and left a distinctive record of glacial deposits across southern Africa, South America, Australia, Antarctica, and India. The therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles that dominated the Permian world and that very nearly produced mammals before the Permian extinction intervened, were primarily a Gondwanan fauna. The Karoo Basin of South Africa contains the most complete record of Permian terrestrial vertebrate evolution anywhere in the world, preserving the full sequence of therapsid evolution from the earliest large carnivores of the early Permian through the advanced cynodonts of the late Permian that were, by every morphological criterion, essentially mammals in all but name. These animals lived in the vast floodplains and river valleys of southern Gondwana, environments that stretched across what are now the most remote corners of the southern hemisphere, connected by the geography of a supercontinent, whose coherence allowed species to disperse across thousands of miles of continuous landmass. Here is something that changes how you look at the world. When you look at a globe and see the southern continents, you are looking at the dismembered remains of Gondwana. The fit between the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa is not an accident of geography. It is the scar of a rifting event that began approximately 130 million years ago and tore a single continent into two pieces. The glacial striations visible in rocks near Cape Town, South Africa, and the identical striations in rocks near Sao Paulo, Brazil, were made by the same glaciers on the same continent during the same ice age. The coal measures of Antarctica and the coal measures of Australia were laid down in the same swampy Gondwanan forests. The dinosaurs of Patagonia and the dinosaurs of the Sahara were neighbors. And then there are the animals. The distribution of marsupials is one of the most vivid demonstrations of Gondwana's influence on the modern world. Marsupials evolved in the northern hemisphere and dispersed southward through South America into what was then an Antarctica that was still connected to both South America and Australia. As Gondwana fragmented and Antarctica became isolated and then glaciated, the marsupials in Australia were cut off from the rest of the world. They evolved independently for millions of years, producing the extraordinary diversity of kangaroos, wallabies, wombats, koalas, quolls, and thylacines that characterized Australia's mammal fauna before the arrival of humans. The opossums of the Americas are the remnant population that remained behind when the connection was severed. When you watch a kangaroo bounding across the Australian outback, you are watching a living consequence of a continental fragmentation event that began 180 million years ago. But Gondwana's greatest contribution to life was not the distribution of its fauna. It was the environments it created and the evolutionary experiments it enabled. During its long tenure, from its assembly approximately 550 million years ago to its final fragmentation roughly 100 million years ago, a span of nearly 500 million years, Gondwana hosted some of the most significant evolutionary events in the history of animal life. The Cambrian explosion of animal body plans occurred on Gondwanan margins. The colonization of land by plants and animals during the Ordovician and Silurian occurred in part in Gondwanan coastal environments. The extraordinary fish fauna of the Devonian period, the Age of Fishes, which we have discussed before, evolved in and around Gondwanan seas. And the Permian period, the world before dinosaurs, with its bizarre mammal-like reptiles called therapsids, was dominated by Gondwanan ecosystems. Meanwhile, in the Northern Hemisphere, a parallel story was unfolding. The continental fragments that had not been incorporated into Gondwana, Laurentia, Baltica, Siberia, and various smaller terrains were assembling their own supercontinent through the Caledonian and Variscan orogenies of the Paleozoic. Laurentia and Baltica collided approximately 430 million years ago, forming a continent geologists call Laurussia, or Euramerica. Siberia collided with Laurussia approximately 300 million years ago, raising the Ural Mountains that still divide Europe from Asia today. And finally, approximately 300 million years ago, Gondwana itself began its collision with the northern landmass, a collision so slow that it took nearly 50 million years to complete, raising the Appalachians, the Hercynian Mountains of Europe, the Mauritanides of North Africa, and ultimately assembling the last and most famous supercontinent in Earth's history, Pangea, the last supercontinent. Pangea, the name, from the Greek for all lands, was coined by Alfred Wegener in 1915, in his landmark paper proposing the theory of continental drift. Wegener's insight that the continents had once been joined together was derided by most of his contemporaries who could not imagine a mechanism that could move land masses across ocean basins. He died in Greenland in 1930, leading an expedition across the ice cap without seeing his theory vindicated. 30 years later, the discovery of seafloor spreading and the development of plate tectonics theory provided exactly the mechanism his critics had demanded. Pangea was complete approximately 300 million years ago at the beginning of the Permian period. It was a single continent stretching from pole to pole, flanked by a single global ocean, the Panthalassa, meaning all seas, and a smaller embayment on its eastern side called the Tethys Sea, which occupied roughly the position of the modern Mediterranean and Middle East. The arrangement was not symmetrical. The southern portion, Gondwana, was much larger than the northern portion, Laurasia. And the interior of this vast landmass was, by any measure, one of the most hostile environments life has ever faced on the surface of a habitable planet. The assembly of Pangea through the Variscan and Appalachian orogenies was not a gentle process. The collision of Gondwana with Laurussia, the supercontinent formed by the earlier merger of Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia, was one of the most sustained and geologically consequential collision events of the Paleozoic. The Appalachian Mountains of eastern North America are the deeply eroded remnants of a range that, at the peak of the Pangean assembly approximately 300 million years ago, may have stood as high as the modern Himalayas, 6 or 7 miles above sea level, with glaciers on their upper slopes and rivers of sediment cascading off their flanks into the shallow seas of what is now the American interior. The matching stump of those same mountains are visible today in the remnants of the Caledonian origin in Scotland and Norway, and the Hercynian belt of Central Europe, the rocks that were joined across what would become the North Atlantic before Pangea's breakup tore them apart. The closure of the Rheic Ocean, the body of water that had separated Gondwana from Laurussia for most of the Paleozoic, involved the subduction of hundreds of miles of oceanic crust, driving volcanic arc activity along the margins of both approaching continents and delivering enormous quantities of CO2, sulfur dioxide, and other volcanic gases to the atmosphere. The collision itself, once the oceanic crust was consumed and the continents began to make direct contact, produced the mountain building that is recorded in the rock. Thrust faults, metamorphic rocks, granitic intrusions that record the heat and pressure of deep crustal collision. These events reshaped not only the geography, but the ocean circulation patterns of the late Paleozoic world, closing off shallow seaways that had connected the Tethys Sea to the Panthalassa, and altering the distribution of nutrients and oxygen in ways that had direct biological consequences. The Carboniferous world that preceded the final assembly of Pangea was, in biological terms, one of the most extraordinary periods in Earth's history. The coal forests of Gondwana's northern margins have already been described, those vast swamps of giant lycopsid trees, inhabited by meter-long millipedes and giant dragonflies in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. But the Carboniferous was also the time when the amniote egg evolved, the waterproof, self-contained egg that freed vertebrate reproduction from its dependence on standing water and allowed the first reptiles to colonize the dry interior of Pangea as it was assembling. This was a revolution comparable in significance to the original conquest of land by plants and arthropods. It opened the vast interior of the growing supercontinent to vertebrate life for the first time, creating the conditions for the extraordinary diversification of reptiles that would characterize the Permian and Triassic. The Permian world, the world that Pangea presided over at its most complete, is often described primarily in terms of its ending. The catastrophic Permian-Triassic extinction that eliminated 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. But the Permian world before the extinction was remarkable in its own right. The therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles of Gondwana's Karoo Basin and their relatives across the rest of Pangea, had diversified into an extraordinary range of ecological roles. Dicynodonts, the most successful herbivorous therapsids, ranged in size from rat-sized burrow dwellers to hippopotamus-sized grazers, and were the dominant large herbivores on every continent. Gorgonopsids, large saber-toothed carnivores with a combination of reptilian and mammalian anatomical features, were the apex predators of the Permian terrestrial ecosystem. The cynodonts, from which mammals would eventually evolve, were small, active, warm-blooded or near-warm-blooded animals with differentiated teeth, potential whiskers, and possibly fur, more mammal-like in their physiology than any animal that had preceded them. This world was destroyed in what was probably the most rapid and total biological catastrophe in the history of complex life. The eruption of the Siberian traps, beginning approximately 252 million years ago, released lava across an area larger than the continental United States and injected enough CO2, methane, and hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere to trigger a cascading sequence of environmental disasters, rapid global warming, ocean acidification, widespread ocean anoxia, ozone layer destruction by volcanic halogen emissions, and the direct toxic effects of volcanic gases on terrestrial ecosystems. The Pangean geography amplified every one of these effects. The restricted ocean circulation of the Panthalassa and the Tethys made the spread of ocean anoxia faster and more complete than it would have been in a more fragmented ocean. The vast interior deserts of Pangea had no buffer against the warming. The shallow coastal environments that supported most marine biodiversity were small in area and close to sources of terrestrial pollution. Everything that Pangea's geography had made vulnerable was now exposed to the maximum possible stress. The recovery from the Permian-Triassic extinction took approximately 10 million years, a geological eye blink by some standards, but an eternity measured in the generations of organisms that had to find a way to survive in a world stripped of most of its ecological structure. The Triassic began as a world of survivors, a few lineages of reptiles, some fish, some marine invertebrates, early relatives of modern clam shrimp and horseshoe crabs, and the cynodonts that would eventually give rise to mammals, picking through the wreckage of the most diverse biosphere that had ever existed. The dominance hierarchies of the Permian had been erased. The ecological roles that had been occupied for hundreds of millions of years were vacant. The world was open, and evolution rushed to fill it. The first dinosaurs appear in the fossil record approximately 235 million years ago, in the Middle Triassic, in rocks from South America that was still part of the southern landmass. They were small, some no larger than a domestic cat, bipedal, active, and initially unimpressive compared to the large cruratarsal reptiles, the pseudosuchians, that dominated the Triassic terrestrial ecosystem. The dinosaurs were a minor component of a world dominated by their more conservative cousins. And for the first 20 or 30 million years of the Triassic, there was nothing in the fossil record to suggest that they were destined for anything other than a modest evolutionary niche. Then the Carnian pluvial episode struck, approximately 234 million years ago. 2 million years of dramatically intensified rainfall, associated with the first major pulse of Pangean rifting as the Proto-Atlantic Rift System began to open in what is now the eastern seaboard of North America and the northwestern coast of Africa. The volcanic activity associated with this rifting, recorded in the enormous lava flows of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest flood basalt events of the Mesozoic, injected enough CO2 into the atmosphere to dramatically intensify the global hydrological cycle, converting the arid interior deserts of the Triassic into temporarily wetter environments and disrupting the ecosystems that had adapted to the dry Triassic conditions. Many of the large pseudosuchians that had dominated the early Triassic were ecologically disrupted by these changes. The dinosaurs, with their more flexible metabolisms and their bipedal locomotion that was effective in both wet and dry conditions, survived the disruption better. By the end of the Carnian pluvial episode, the dinosaurs were on their way to the dominance of terrestrial ecosystems that would last for the next 135 million years. The subsequent history of Pangea's breakup and the Mesozoic world it created is the story of the continents we recognize today. assembled through rifting and separation into their modern configurations. The Jurassic period, the world of the giant sauropods, the largest land animals that have ever lived, reaching lengths of 30 meters and weights of 70 tons, was a world in which Pangea's breakup was well underway, but the fragments had not yet separated to their modern distances. North America and Europe were still connected through Greenland, allowing the exchange of dinosaur faunas across what would become the North Atlantic. The Tethys Sea was open and warm, its shallow carbonate platforms hosting some of the richest marine ecosystems of the Mesozoic. And in the southern hemisphere, Gondwana was fragmenting, South America separating slowly from Africa, Antarctica separating from Australia, creating the new ocean basins whose circulation would reshape the climate of the entire planet. The Cretaceous period, the final chapter of the Age of Dinosaurs, was the warmest interval of the past 500 million years, with global average temperatures perhaps 12 to 14 degrees Celsius higher than today, polar regions that were temperate rather than frozen, and sea levels that were roughly 200 meters higher than the modern, flooding vast areas of continental interior with warm, shallow seas. The western interior seaway of North America, a shallow body of water that divided the continent into two landmasses from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, was a consequence of both the warm climate and the specific tectonic configuration of the Cretaceous, as the Farallon Plate subducting beneath western North America drove dynamic subsidence of the continental interior. In these warm, shallow seas, and on the land surfaces surrounding them, the Cretaceous ecosystem reached a level of biological complexity and diversity that would not be matched again until the Cenozoic. Think about what it means to be in the center of a continent the size of Pangea. The moderating influence of the ocean on climate diminishes with distance from the coast. At the heart of Pangea, which was thousands of miles from any ocean in every direction, the climate was extreme in both directions, brutally hot in summer, savagely cold in winter, and almost uniformly arid. The monsoon systems that brought rainfall to the coastal regions of Pangea could not penetrate to its interior. Deserts extended from the tropics to the high latitudes. The red sandstones of the American Southwest, the Triassic red beds of England, the Permian red beds of Central Europe, these are all relics of those interior Pangean deserts, dried and oxidized in an environment that received almost no rainfall. And the ocean was struggling. Panthalassa was so vast and its circulation so restricted by the unusual geography that vast regions of the deep ocean became anoxic, depleted of oxygen. Organic matter that sank to the seafloor could not be oxidized and buried, creating what geologists call black shales, dark, organic, rich sediments that record the suffocation of the deep ocean. For the organisms living in those waters, the situation was becoming dire. The Siberian traps fired into an ocean that Pangea had already wounded. The geography loaded the gun. The volcanism pulled the trigger. New data published in 2025 has revised the understanding of the Permian extinction scale on land. The traditional view held that terrestrial ecosystems recovered relatively quickly, that the severity of the extinction on land was less than in the ocean. The new evidence suggests this was wrong. High-resolution analysis of continental sediments from multiple locations shows that terrestrial ecosystems collapsed more completely and recovered more slowly than previously believed, with a gap of several million years after the extinction event, in which large-bodied vertebrates were essentially absent from the fossil record. Pangea did not merely witness the Permian extinction, the geography of Pangea amplified it. And then Pangea began to tear. Not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, over tens of millions of years, as the rifting forces that had been building beneath the supercontinent's crust finally overwhelmed the strength of the rock. The first rifts appeared approximately 230 million years ago in the Triassic, as proto-Atlantic rift basins began opening along what is now the eastern seaboard of North America and the western coast of Africa. But before Pangea's final breakup began in earnest, another extraordinary event punctuated the Triassic world. Between 234 and 232 million years ago, a geological instant, the climate of the Triassic underwent a dramatic disruption that left a distinctive record in sediments on every major continent. Heavy rainfall, extensive flooding, massive erosion. The disappearance of many Triassic species and their rapid replacement by new ones. Geologists call this the Carnian pluvial episode, the 2 million years of rain. And it coincides almost exactly with the first major pulse of Pangean rifting, when extensive volcanism associated with the opening Proto-Atlantic rift system may have injected enough CO2 into the atmosphere to dramatically intensify the global water cycle. The Carnian pluvial episode is not merely a strange climatic footnote. It is the moment when the first dinosaurs appeared in the fossil record. The extinction of many of their Triassic competitors during this event created the ecological opening that dinosaurs exploited to begin their dominance of terrestrial ecosystems, a dominance that would persist for 135 million years. The birth of the age of dinosaurs was a consequence of Pangea tearing itself apart. The breakup proceeded in stages. The North Atlantic began opening approximately 180 million years ago, as North America separated from Europe and Africa. The South Atlantic opened approximately 130 million years ago, as South America separated from Africa. India separated from Antarctica and began its extraordinary northward journey at approximately 130 million years ago, moving at the geologically rapid pace of roughly 15 to 20 centimeters per year, faster than any major continent in the Mesozoic record. Australia separated from Antarctica approximately 85 million years ago, and Antarctica settled over the South Pole, becoming thermally isolated by the opening of the Drake Passage. Between 35 and 30 million years ago, the event that established the Antarctic Circumpolar Current and began the glaciation of Antarctica that persists today. Each of these rifting events had biological consequences. The separation of continents created evolutionary isolation. Populations of organisms that had been in contact were divided by growing ocean basins and began evolving independently. The dinosaurs of South America and the dinosaurs of North America diverged after the Atlantic opened. The mammals that survived the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period diversified separately on different continents as Pangea's fragments drifted apart. The marsupials of Australia evolved in isolation from the placental mammals of the rest of the world. The biodiversity of the modern world, its extraordinary variety of species on different continents, is in large part a direct consequence of the fragmentation of Pangea, which created the geographic isolation that allowed evolution to pursue its experiments independently on separate stages. And India's journey deserves its own moment of attention. When India separated from what is now Madagascar approximately 88 million years ago and began moving northward across the Tethys Sea, it was carrying the ancestors of the mammals and reptiles that had evolved on the Gondwanan fragment that would become the Indian subcontinent. Over tens of millions of years, India raced northward, geologically speaking, until approximately 50 to 40 million years ago, it collided with the southern margin of Asia. The collision closed the Tethys Sea, which had been a warm, biologically productive ocean for hundreds of millions of years. It raised the Himalayan mountains, which continue to grow today as India pushes northward at roughly 5 centimeters per year. And it created the Tibetan Plateau, the highest large landmass on Earth, whose elevation has had profound effects on global climate, including the strengthening of the Asian monsoon system and the drawdown of atmospheric CO2 through enhanced silicate weathering. India's journey was not just a geological spectacle. It remade the climate of the entire northern hemisphere. Now, and what comes next? Here is where you are in the supercontinent cycle right now. Approximately 180 million years since Pangea began breaking apart. Roughly in the middle of the dispersal phase, the period of maximum continental fragmentation, when the pieces are at their greatest separation and the oceans are at their widest extent. By most measures, the present is geologically unusual. 7 distinct major continents, multiple large ocean basins with vigorous circulation, a climate moderated by the heat-distributing effects of those ocean basins, and a biodiversity that reflects hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary isolation on separate landmasses. This is not the normal state of the planet. Most of Earth's history has been spent either assembling a supercontinent or in the early stages of breaking one apart. The present configuration, 7 continents, moderate climate, biologically rich, is the exception, not the rule. It is the kind of world that the supercontinent cycle produces only briefly at the peak of the dispersal phase, before the gravitational logic of the mantle begins drawing the pieces back together. And the pieces are already moving toward their next assembly. 3 scenarios are currently under active scientific consideration, each representing a different prediction for how the next supercontinent, whatever it is called, will form. The first scenario, called Novo Pangea or Pangea Proxima, predicts that the Atlantic Ocean will eventually stop expanding and reverse direction. As the ocean floor becomes old, cold, and dense enough to begin subducting back into the mantle. Under this scenario, the Americas would drift back toward Europe and Africa, closing the Atlantic from its current width of roughly 5,000 miles to nothing over the next 250 million years. A new Himalayan-scale mountain chain would rise where the continents collide. The Pacific, which is already shrinking as the Americas move westward, would ultimately become the dominant ocean. The second scenario, called Orica, predicts that both the Atlantic and the Pacific will close simultaneously, with the continents converging through the disappearance of both ocean basins and assembling a new supercontinent somewhere roughly over the present equatorial region. The third scenario, the one that has attracted the most scientific attention in recent years, is called Amarcia. Under this model, the Americas continue drifting northward as they have been, eventually colliding with Asia across the Arctic Ocean. The Atlantic remains open while the Pacific closes. The new supercontinent forms over the North Pole, incorporating North America, Asia, and eventually the rest of the landmasses into a single Arctic supercontinent. All three scenarios agree on one thing. Within approximately 250 million years, the current configuration of continents will be unrecognizable. The map of the world as it exists today, the map that humans have explored, named, divided, and fought over, is a temporary arrangement. It was preceded by arrangements utterly unlike it, and it will be followed by arrangements equally alien. But the most sobering scientific contribution to this discussion came not from a model of future tectonics, but from a climate simulation published in 2023 in the journal Nature Geoscience. A team of researchers modeled the climate conditions that would prevail on the most likely candidate for the next supercontinent, a configuration broadly similar to Pangea Proxima, and found results that were, by any standard, alarming. A supercontinent centered on the tropics and subtropics, with vast interior regions thousands of miles from the moderating influence of the ocean, would be subject to extreme temperatures in its interior. The researchers calculated that the combination of continental geography, a sun that will be approximately 2.5% more luminous in 250 million years than it is today, and the expected CO2 levels from ongoing volcanic activity would produce interior temperatures of 50 to 70 degrees Celsius during summer months. Only approximately 8% of the supercontinent's surface area would be habitable for mammals, defined as areas where the combination of temperature and humidity would allow a mammal's core body temperature to be maintained without lethal overheating. The rest would be effectively uninhabitable. This does not mean that life will end. The ocean will persist, and life in the ocean may be minimally affected by continental configuration in the long term. But the terrestrial world, the world of forests and grasslands and large animals, would be profoundly diminished. The supercontinent cycle, which has driven the evolution of complex life for over 500 million years, would in this scenario threaten the very complexity it helped create. Now let me tell you what I think about all of this, as someone who has spent time with the geological record of this planet across the full span of its history. The supercontinent cycle is the closest thing this planet has to a recurring narrative. It is a story that has told itself 5 times over 4 billion years, each iteration different in its details. Different continents, different biota, different climate states, but similar in its fundamental structure. Continents gather, The consequences are severe. They disperse. The consequences are transformative. Life adapts, and the cycle begins again. What strikes me most about this story is not the geological mechanics, extraordinary as they are. It is the relationship between the tectonic cycle and the evolutionary record. Every major transition in the history of life, the Great Oxidation Event, the Ediacaran radiation, the Cambrian explosion, the colonization of land, the age of dinosaurs, the rise of mammals, is either directly caused by or deeply influenced by the supercontinent cycle. The biodiversity of the modern world, with all its extraordinary variety, is a product of the continental fragmentation that followed the breakup of Pangea. The large brains and cognitive flexibility of mammals, including the primate lineage that produced us, evolved in the context of the isolated, fragmented, highly variable world that Pangea's breakup created. We are, in a very direct sense, the children of Pangea's disassembly. The cognitive architecture that allows you to understand the concept of a supercontinent cycle was shaped by the evolutionary pressures of a fragmented, variable world, whose fragmentation was itself a consequence of continental drift. The very capacity for abstract thought that makes this story comprehensible to you exists because a supercontinent broke apart 180 million years ago and created the conditions for mammalian diversification. There is also something humbling about the timescales involved. The entire history of Homo sapiens, from the appearance of our species in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago to the present, occupies less than 0.03% of the time covered by this story. The entire span of recorded human history, from the first writing systems to the present, is less than 1/1,000,000th of the age of the oldest supercontinent we have discussed. These are not numbers that the human mind can intuitively grasp, but the geological record makes them real. The rocks are there, the magnetic signatures are there, the mountain belts and the banded iron formations, and the fossilized coral reefs that grew in oceans that have been gone for 500 million years are there. The history is written in stone, literally, and it does not care whether we can comprehend its scale. What the history of supercontinents ultimately teaches is that the planet's geography is not a fixed backdrop against which the drama of life unfolds. It is a participant in that drama, an active, changing, consequential participant whose movements on geological timescales have repeatedly altered the direction of evolution, triggered mass extinctions, created new worlds of biological possibility, and shaped the physical environment in which every organism that has ever lived had to find a way to survive. The machine that Harvard's team identified running 3.5 billion years ago in the ancient rocks of Western Australia is still running. The plates are still moving, right now, under your feet, at the pace of your fingernails growing. In the time it took you to watch this video, the Atlantic Ocean has grown slightly wider. Australia has moved slightly closer to Asia, and Africa has continued its slow collision with Europe that will eventually close the Mediterranean entirely. The continents are not where they were this morning. They will not be where they are now when your grandchildren are born. The next supercontinent is coming. Not in any timescale that has meaning for a human life, or for the entire history of human civilization, or for anything that any human institution could plan for. But it is coming. 250 million years from now, the pieces will have found each other again, and the cycle will have completed another revolution. What life will be present to experience that assembly, whether any descendant of the organisms now alive will survive the process, is a question that the geological record, with its repeated demonstrations of both catastrophe and resilience, leaves open. The machine does not care. It simply runs, as it has for 3.5 billion years, and as it will, barring some intervention that geology cannot foresee, for billions more.